Thank you, Thibault. Thank you for your brief introduction, and thank you also for the opportunity to moderate today's panel. Our discussion indeed will be on computational analysis of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, and our panel will focus on leveraging the power of computational tools. And more specifically, algorithmic technique of natural language processing in order to explore how different stakeholders understand the terms such as gatekeepers or self-preferencing. And I'm very happy to welcome our today's speaker, Fabiana Di Porto, as well as Daniel Crane. Fabiana Di Porto is professor of law and technology at the University of Salento in Italy. Professor Di Porto presides the PRIN-funded research project on algorithmic disclosure regulation. She works with Tatiana Grütte, who is supposed to be our another speaker today. And on the other hand, Daniel Crane is the Frederick Spohl First Senior Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. Professor Crane served as the Associate Dean for Faculty and Research from 2013 to 2016. For the next 20 minutes, we'll listen to the presentation of Fabiana Di Porto, and the next 15 minutes we'll hear from Daniel Crane. Please don't hesitate to ask questions in the Q&A section. And without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Professor Fabiana Di Porto for her presentation.
Good evening to everyone. I wish to express my gratitude to the Stanford Law School and the Codex Center and the Stanford Computational Project, its staff, and its generous and visionary coordinator, Thibault Schreppel, for this invitation, this kind invitation. And also, I want to express my gratitude to my co-author, who could not be here, and especially to Tatiana Grütte, who could not make it for tonight, but who also thank everyone. So let me start, and I hope the presentation is visible to everyone. So when back to 2020, Executive Vice President Margarete Vestager presented the DSA and DMA, she highlighted that it was complex, but they were looking forward to it. Of course, the breakthrough reform Commissioner Vestager was referring to was really a major and breakthrough reform, because it was shifting all the antitrust intervention from an ex post enforcement towards an ex ante regulation. And it was meant to be really a blueprint for regulation of digital technology around the globe, like the US and China as well. Such a shift was profound, is profound, and pertains both the goals, the tools, and the terminology of competition law. According to the Commission, this shift is powered by a growing consensus that traditional antitrust tools are inadequate to tackle the competition problems of the years to come. And therefore, ex-ante regulatory tool is much better and more appropriate. So when looking at the DSA and DMA proposals and along the debates that surrounded their drafted, one will quickly notice one thing, that many key questions, for instance, how to define the scope of application of the new rules, involve some relatively new terms like gatekeepers. These are also there are also some anti-competitive practices like self-preferencing or remedies like blacklists that are really not yet part of the traditional competition law vocabulary. Hence, we asked specifically, are all stakeholders groups sharing the same understanding and therefore use of relevant terms and concepts of the DSA and DMA? Or can we identify different attitudes towards these issues? And to do so, and to answer these questions, we decided to use and employ computational tools. So how can computational tools contribute to these, to answer these research questions? Actually, there are several advantages arising from the use of computational tools in the legal analysis and antitrust law specifically. A lot have already been outlined by many prestigious speakers who presented before me. I would only delve into two of them in this presentation. The first one is velocity. Computers can, of course, process documents much faster than humans, and sometimes only within a fraction of seconds. For instance, if we have to read thousands of feedback documents to a consultation, we could have it done by algorithms. Hence, algorithms allow to scale up our analysis. Of course, they would, sorry, for instance, if we have to read thousands of documents and we want to have such reading made not only faster, but even deeply, we can have it done much deeper by an algorithm. Of course, this reading would be different from one made by a human being. And for that reason, that would require human intervention. That human intervention would be needed for selecting the input, for manually instructing the machine, for adequately providing a method, and also for sound knowledge of how to interpret the results. The second reason is the ability to discern hidden patterns and that would not see with a close reading. Because of the novelty of the many terms used in the DSA and the DMA and the issues surrounding digital competition, there is no established common understanding. A large part of the debate on new rules for digital markets that were prior to the publication of the DSA and the DMA, there was actually a lot of debate that was centered around how to define relevant terms like gatekeepers, self-preferencing, but also established terms were new, not in their understanding per se, but on the way that they were to be applied to digital markets. So for instance, the EU consultations over what became the DMA, the Commission concluded that all stakeholders demanding new rules for the gatekeepers, which explicitly prohibited anti-competitive practices. This sounded like a consensus at first. However, how could we know that all participants are having the same platforms and practices in mind? When the key terms they are using, like for instance, gatekeepers, are themselves still up to debate. As I was mentioning before, even terms that were more consolidated, like for instance, dominant positions or even dominant firms, which were more established, were still not so clear in the sense of how they could be applied to digital markets. So therefore, as we shall see, this was also well reflected in the feedback documents to the European Commission's public consultation. So what I am telling basically is that all these feedback documents are of a source of an extremely valuable source of knowledge, and in order to understand how those affected by those new rules from individuals to big platforms perceive the problems addressed and the solutions proposed by the European Commission. Simply reading these feedback documents might, however, not suffice to actually develop a precise understanding of the stakeholders' take on certain critical questions. And therefore, we might not be sure whether the competitive issue at stance is adequately tackled. Consider that many does not and don't rules depend on the stakeholders' behavior to be enforced. This is where algorithms entered the scene. Algorithms can help finding some underlying differences in understanding that are not visible at the human eye. So all we can see are words, but not necessarily the way they are understood and used by the drafter. And what we did is using NLP, which has already been mentioned, and especially word embedding models. Word embedding allows us, generally speaking, to express what is the semantic relations between words in numbers and hence to quantify them. It allows us to compare the semantic relationships between words for two different collections of documents. And therefore, we use unsupervised word embedding alignment. Only through this technique, we can meaningfully compare embedding that were trained on different documents to see whether the differences we found not only were not only random noise. We then employed classical statistical testing. Lastly, to better understand the potential reasons for the differences we found, we used also sentiment analysis. As we will explain, I will explain better in a minute, each computational tool served that precise purpose. But let's have a closer look at what we especially, more specifically. So we first scraped all the relevant documents and we cleaned them all not to have noise, and then clustered them into bigger groups. We combined a commission categorization scheme and a quantitative analysis of which documents should be clustered together to do so. We then trained a neural network on the documents of each cluster. Based on the number of times words occur next to each other, the network is allowed to calculate a vector for each word in each corpus. This is the so-called word embedding model. Just to make an example, these models are really remarkable in the sense they can capture the semantic meaning of words in a set of numbers. For instance, if we have a model, a well-trained model, the distance between the vector of the words Paris and France will be more or less the same as between Rome and Italy. Hence, the relative positions of these two vectors will roughly represent the meaning of certain terms. This means that while a simple algorithm would require that researchers formulate explicit rules to approximate the semantic meanings of words, machine learning or this neural network would just allow us to train the neural network on data and to learn this relationship automatically. And therefore, we would not need to make this relationship specific and explicit, but just to train the neural network. To make the model we trained on different corpuses comparable, we use the unsupervised vector space alignment. The vector space alignment, just to make it very simple, allows us to bring the vectors that we trained on two different corpuses just together on just one model space. And this allowed us to make them comparable. And it's like if you project it in a space, in a 3D space, but in order to make it visible for you in this presentation, we just projected on a two-space model, and I will show you it in a minute. And yet, we still needed to ascertain that these differences that we noticed were not just merely incidental, but were actually of certain significance. And therefore, to do so, we just employed a statistical test. So we had this semantic distance, this semantic difference, and we had to establish that this was a difference in meaning and in employment of terms. We used to do so a control vocabulary to get an understanding of what a non-semantic or random difference would look like. We found significant differences for more than 1,000 words, most of which were not really interesting for our analysis because we wanted to focus just on some very specific terms. We had to ex post manually code what were the results of our analysis. So therefore, we have to select what were the terms. What were our data? So I said we focus on the documents that all the stakeholders, individuals, the businesses, NGO, government agencies, lobby groups, and all of that submitted to the open consultations of the three impact assessment documents that the European Commission published. And that later became the DSA and the DMA. We collected and analyzed almost 3,000 feedback documents and replies to the questionnaires. We then collected them into three corpuses, three groups, which were the three corpuses you can see on the slide. And these became our three groups made of individuals and micro-organizations, the small organizations, and then the medium and big organizations. The corpus C is made of what is commonly known as the big techs. First, we created we had, okay, I will not go into that. Okay, let's get to the results. We collected the results, dividing them by three groups. Then we had the first group of results is the actors. And then we have the terms relating to actors. Then we had the terms related to the conducts. And then finally, terms relating to what to do. So the measures. The first result, which is interesting, and then I like it there, is the question of how the gatekeeper should be defined. That was hotly debated, and our results actually confirm that the results of the European Commission consultation. In fact, in all the three corpuses, as you can see, there is a difference in the use of this term by all the three groups. And moving on to the terms related to the conduct, something which is quite interesting is that there is a statistically significant distance between the vector for self-preferencing for the corpuses A and B, as well as for B and C. While the corpuses AC, which are the individuals and the big tech, the alternative term self-favoring is used differently as well, hinting that it is the general concept behind those two terms that seems to be still elusive. This is very interesting to me because if one notes that the DMA in its latest version that has been released on November 26th, 2021, only literally prohibits self-favoring and not self-preferencing. Now, in Corpus A, self-preferencing is most closely relating to monopolizing, suggesting that the anti-competitive outcomes of self-preferencing are a key concern for individuals and micro-organizations, while small companies, on the other hand, associate this practice with over-regulation and reports. This is interesting not only with a view to the prohibition of self-preferencing in Article 6 of the DMA, but also in light with the comprehensive reporting duties on ranking in the DSA. Our results could be interpreted, but this is of course very tentative, as a hint that the small companies and organizations might fear comprehensive transparency and reporting duties, and therefore highlighting the need for a differentiating approach. Let's get to approach the conclusions. After having discussed the actors and their conducts, the next step would be, what shall we do? What to do about it? Concerning the ex-ante measures, an interesting finding would be the blacklist. We find that there is a significant differences in the way the stakeholders use the word blacklist and also data sharing. Concerning blacklist, micro entities and medium big organization use the term very differently. And this disparity is perceived, there is a strange association with the terms that can be explained like a sense of alarm on the side of larger entities that is hinted by the association with the term problem. And while this interpretation is, of course, highly tentative and would need to be confirmed by a qualitative analysis, the second closely related associated term is dominance-based, which is a little bit more telling and highly interesting. I will go to okay, this is my conclusion. As I was telling, we actually can tell a lot about these differences. We found a lot of significant differences in the understanding for many central terms. However, we cannot explain why those differences exist. So those hidden misunderstandings can, of course, be exposed thanks to algorithms, and that means that we could help the commissions as well as those competition agencies that are now undergoing the process of modifying or legislators and regulators that are approaching the process of modifying the rules towards digital markets to help clarifying the rules they are adopting, especially when those rules depend, as far as the enforcement is concerned, on the action of the addressees. And also, of course, our analysis got some limitations, not only is our corpus rather small, and we could adopt some technical techniques like bootstrapping in order to enlarge our corpus, but we could also, let's say, let our analysis evolve, and also in order to have enhanced replicability, we should try to limit as far as possible manual coding, which was exposed, as we already said, but in anyway, we did manual coding. And finally, really, this is my last word, and I conclude. Next, we think that despite those limitations, there is really a plus in order for competition authorities and rulemakers more broadly, in order to have and to use these tools to combine their usual job with the computational tools, and eventually, in order to strengthen our analysis, we should have a sort of toolbox, a computational toolbox, made also of other techniques like topic modeling, which was already mentioned, but also text and document similarity measures, which could be used in order, for instance, to compare the two versions of the DSA and DMA, especially the last version that was released 2 weeks ago by the European Council, which is slightly different by the one that was adopted 1 year ago. And then sentiment analysis, which also might help elucidating on the position of the stakeholders. And of course, transnational is also an issue which is extremely useful, because clarifying on those terms would also help, considering the intrinsically transnational nature of digital markets would necessarily need to be, this analysis would necessarily need to be transnational, so therefore including actors and stakeholders that are in other parts of the globe, not just Europe. Okay, thank you. This is some ads, promotion, self-promotion. We have done other work on the topic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Fabiana, for your insightful presentation. Just a quick reminder for the audience that you can ask your questions in the Q&A section. And I'm leaving the floor to Daniel for your comments on the Fabiana's presentation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Alexandra, and thank you to Thibaut for putting on this wonderful conference and for inviting me to participate in it. And to Fabiana and her co-authors, congratulations on a really nice and interesting paper, which I think is really the starting place for much future analysis. So like Pinar in the last segment, I am someone who does not have any expertise at all in the techniques of computational law or computational antitrust or NLP. I'm really coming at these as a consumer of the work product you create as opposed to a producer of it. And so what I want to do is really ask some questions. I'll ask 4 particular questions that strike me as a potential user of these kinds of analyses about what I should make of them. So the first question is, what have I learned here, or what should I be learning that I wouldn't have predicted with a high level of confidence without this kind of a study being done? So give 2 examples. The fact that larger and medium-sized companies have a more favorable disposition towards the term self-regulatory, and that smaller entities and maybe individuals have a less favorable disposition towards the term self-regulatory strikes me as being not surprising at all. It's exactly what I would have predicted. Regulation by the government, of course, is in place to protect the weaker from the stronger. And so self-regulation is really non-regulation, if you will. And so it strikes me as being exactly what I predicted, that smaller entities would have a more favorable or less favorable view of self-regulation, whereas larger entities would, of course, think that they can manage these processes by themselves. On the other hand, I would not necessarily have expected, and I think this is the key observation of the paper, that different stakeholder groups would actually use the terms differently, right? And this is an important observation because it suggests not only different perspectives among different classes of stakeholders, but that the language itself is manipulable, that it can mean different things in different people's mouths, or that they can construct it differently. And that's really important because this suggests that these ideas do not necessarily have a fixed objective meaning, as we know from theory of language, words do not, and they can lead to the same language deployed in different occasions and different contexts can lead to different outcomes, particularly if different regulatory processes are captured by one stakeholder group or another. The choice of language may not be that significant if the different stakeholders have the ability to manipulate it to mean different things in different occasions. The second question goes to explanation. So what actually explains this dispersion in attitudes among key terms among different stakeholder groups? And so I can throw out a few different possible theses or explanations and see if any of these, or they can all be true in some level, but see what makes sense. The first one is attitudinal, which is that these stakeholder groups simply have different underlying preferences that translate into different understandings of the regulatory ecosystems in which they operate. Now, those could be normative preferences in the sense that they have different actual preferences as to what's best for them, or they could be just revealed preferences, simply this is how they kind of vote with their feet or with their language. But the observation would simply be that by observing the differing deployment of language among different stakeholder groups, we can actually observe how they think differently, how they have different preferences about their regulatory landscape. The second one is more strategic, and that is to say that different stakeholder groups are trying to shape the meaning of regulatory language as they interact with regulators. Now, of course, language is not merely reflective. Language is not simply taking what's already created. It's every time a speaker touches or appropriate language, they can be constitutive, right? Trying to change the meaning of the language. So part of these dispersions in the use of key terms by stakeholders may simply be a strategic effort, not that they actually understand these terms differently in terms of their baseline preferences, but they're actually trying to shape what it means to be a gatekeeper or what dominance means to create a different outcome that satisfies or maximizes their preferences. And then the third kind of bucket of possibilities here for me is institutional. And that is that perhaps different stakeholder groups are coalescing around the same political intermediaries. That could be law firms, that could be trade associations, that could be lobbyists, that could be other sources of information. But their deployment of language simply reflects the ways in which they're accessing the language or the intermediaries to which they're channeling their comments to the regulatory agencies. And that would be an interesting story because it would suggest that part of what's going on here is not so much the underlying stakeholders themselves, but that they're intermediaries who are shaping the regulatory landscape through their deployment of language. The third question I wanted to pose is, how are stakeholder uses of language shaped by the background political, legal, regulatory, or constitutional conditions in which those stakeholders operate? And in particular, do stakeholders adapt their deployment of language differently in different regulatory environments? So for example, in American laws, we know the attitudes towards dominance have been much more permissive towards dominant firms, even dominant firms that exploit their market advantages, than EU law has been for a long period of time. Now, that doesn't have to be forever. And as we know, in the United States right now, that may be changing. There may be legislation, there may be case law developments. Certainly the antitrust agencies now are trying to change some of that perspective. But as a background condition, the stakeholders would simply have a different view of the connotation of language based upon the regulatory baselines in which they operate. So for example, self-preferencing. The paper mentions the Google shopping case in which the EU found Google liable for abuse of dominance under Article 102 for self-preferencing. For now, at least, the leading preference in the United States, the leading precedent in the United States is the 2013 decision of the Federal Trade Commission, holding that Google's self-preferencing, its vertical search bias, was not a problem. In fact, this benefited consumers. And so even though, of course, that is being reconsidered now by the Justice Department and perhaps by the federal courts, perhaps by Congress, perhaps by FTC rulemaking, it still sets a kind of a different baseline of expectation on whether self-preferencing has a negative connotation or a neutral connotation, or maybe a positive connotation, depending upon whether the entity, the stakeholder, is coming from one regulatory tradition or another regulatory tradition. So I think it'd be really interesting to know if we could code stakeholders geographically and determine the effect of background regulatory socialization on their deployment of regulatory rhetoric. Excuse me. And then my fourth and final question is, what use can be made of this sort of analysis by different constituencies, or really who's the audience of this information, and how can different audiences use or abuse this kind of information? So I think the paper, as I read it, seems to be targeted primarily at regulators, sort of trying to give regulatory authorities more information about how stakeholders think about the deployment of language in key things like the DMA. But it could also be the case that the stakeholder groups themselves will make use of this kind of analysis. If regulators were to begin using this kind of computational techniques to inform regulatory design, what strategic responses should we envision from competing stakeholder groups? And just follow some public choice theory down the pike, and you would predict that stakeholder groups would get savvy, that if these kinds of computational methods are being used to shape regulatory outcomes, then we need to sort of paper our record in ways that are strategically designed to achieve the regulatory outcomes that we prefer. So how should I think about the repeat player game here, which is if this kind of analysis comes to inform regulatory decision making, are there ways it can be exploited, it can be manipulated by key stakeholder groups? And would that, I mean, and then are there counter strategies by regulators, right? Can you outsmart the regulated entities who may want to use these kinds of interventions in ways that would actually defeat the regulator's purpose in also using the same kind of regulatory technique? So again, I know that that's a question really beyond the scope of the paper, but as a consumer of these kinds of analyses, they're the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. But again, really interesting project. Really learned a lot from it, and look forward to hearing more work down this line. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. It was your questions were really thought-provoking. Fabiana, do you want to respond?
Okay. Yes. Sure. Okay, I think that a lot of the questions thank you very much for your careful reading, and thank you for the comments and the questions, which I think that delve around the idea of manipulation. I think you quoted the word, you used the word manipulation several times. Eventually, you use it almost in all of your questions. I'm not using my algorithm here, but I think that you used it at least in, yes, almost in all of your questions, which means that you're very worried about the idea that eventually the use of algorithms by competition authorities, rule makers, legislators, regulators, whoever, is really worrisome somehow for you. Eventually, this is of course tentative, would require some more qualitative analysis, and if you are feeling like I might ask some questions in a side session. Okay, now coming to your questions. Of course, people tell different things in different sessions, and depending on the environment and depending on the language they're using, and depending on the institutional environment they are digged in, of course. We analyzed documents that were drafted by several different stakeholders, most of which were non-English speakers, native speakers. We excluded especially documents that were not drafted in English, of course. This because our algorithm was, we needed to run our analysis only in one language, at least for now. And of course, all of the big texts were in, therefore they were not European, they were Americans, and they contributed to this consultation process. Did they respond the same way an NGO would respond? Of course not. Were the questions the same? Some of them were the same, some of them were not. This is the reason why the Commission allows all respondents to both respond through the questionnaires and to also attach a document whereby everyone is allowed to just answer the way freely, completely free, and use the jargon they prefer. And this is where our algorithm could identify the largest differences and the widest differences, but also where our algorithm had the widest vocabulary and therefore could perform with the best data in a way. And of course, there, I'm sure I did not check, but of course, their companies might have referred to concepts which are not European or are not in line with the European competition law jargon, like dominant position. They might have used concepts like monopolization, which are more accustomed to the US jargon, antitrust jargon, of course. And this is where we could measure these distances, and this is why it was useful. So another thing which is also interesting and relevant is that we had this problem. How do we build the clusters? Because one thing is considering small and medium firms from an economic point of view, and another thing is to consider the same entities and compare them from an NLP perspective. Language is completely different, and the way a big firm expresses itself is totally different, because the document that is produced by a huge firm is not the same as an academic produces its own document, of course. But from an NLP perspective and from our perspective, it's completely the same. We just analyze documents and words and association between the expressions. So when we had to clusterize the people, we ran a cosmogorov test, which actually allowed us to clusterize these. So we end up having medium and large entities in the same group, something that in economic term does not make any sense. But from a linguistic point of view, this made absolutely sense. So would that be manipulated? I don't know. I cannot tell you straight away, because first of all, imagine that the European Commission decides to use algorithms and NLP techniques in order to streamline the hard job of close reading all the documents, the thousands of documents of a consultation process. Of course, that would not, first of all, that would not exclude close reading. And second, that would not exclude lobby. That would not exclude all the remaining processes, and that would not exclude cost-benefit analysis. This is just something that would be on top of the rest. And third, trying to answer, and I hope I somehow answered some of your questions. I hope I responded the answer about the background and also about the context and institution. So the other question was, who is the audience of this paper? So the more visionary question, let's say, who is the audience of this paper? Well, I think the audience of this paper is the legislator, the competition authority, and more broadly, the rule maker, which can, of course, include regulators. Do I think that algorithms could be used and computational tools more broadly in the future in order to produce rules or to implement rules, to enforce rules, well, with a high degree of a visionary attitude. My personal opinion, based on my research, which I actually showed in my last slide, the thank you slide, I would say partially yes. And also I would add that I think that in the future, we would have rules that will be eventually self-implementable rules, whereby rule makers would provide specifications to the industry that would eventually implement.
Thank you, Fabiana. I have a question from Thibaut, actually. So I'll give you the floor.
Sure. Thank you very much. And we have a few questions in the Q&A I can see, but it seems to me that indeed, as a regulator, you may want to avoid the use of certain keywords if you know that they are not understood the same way. So this could be something which is relevant for them when they draft legislation. My question is actually for Dan. You are working on the history of anti-monopoly. And I'm wondering if the results that Fabiana is showing, and that's something that you touched upon already when discussing, the relationship that big companies may have with antitrust law. Is that something which is consistent with what you found in your research, or do you see that there is a change in the way they approach antitrust laws?
Well, that's a broad question, and my research on anti-monopoly goes back hundreds or thousands of years, and so I think you get different attitudes at different times. I do think some of these techniques, and also the techniques presented in the previous panel, would actually be very useful, though, in doing historical research on attitudes towards monopolies. So, for example, I'm doing a read right now of every case, a U.S. case in state or federal court in the 19th century that uses the word monopoly, just several thousand cases, and whether some of these techniques can be useful to me just analytically to sort of try to cluster words together. I think that could be really useful. So I'm interested in learning more about, again, I'm more of a consumer than probably a producer of these technologies, but I can certainly see how they could be very useful.
Thank you, Dan. As Thibaut said, we have some questions in the Q&A section, and there is one about the linguistic considerations, because the EU is it's very diverse when it comes to languages. So the question from Pierre is whether there is some kind of correction taken into account, because the usage of English words might not be the native language of that the party is using. So the question is whether do you take it into account?
Yes, we did. We did take it into account. However, we could not actually, we considered that. However, we could not translate them directly into an instruction to be given to the algorithm. We knew that, we accounted for that, but we could not translate it into any instruction.
Thank you. So I have another question about from the Q&A section as well. Can AI algorithm trained with machine learning create new words? So the words that still do not exist in the legal field.
Okay, we have natural language processing. We have also let's say a branch of the natural language processing, which is the natural language producing, which is something that is developing, of course, and we have actually several services that are based on this technology, the more and more chatbot bots that uses this technology, and even Alexa, just to make an example, use this, but to specifically for the legal domain, it is extremely difficult, just because rules, legal rules, entail so much more than just duties or prohibitions, just to make it simple. As we know from the times of Professor Lessig's code, rules are much more and implies so much more than just duties and prohibitions. There is so much more content that cannot be coded, and therefore, let's say that at this time, and consider this level of the level of technology thus far available, I don't think that rules are completely codable, and therefore we cannot thus far produce rules completely automatically. I am working hardly on these types of projects. I also have hosted a seminar last year, convening a lot of experts in this area. It was called the Law and RegTech Seminar, and Thibault was also one of the guests of the seminar. And but I can tell you that it is not yet the time. I'm not saying that it will not be possible. I can also add that regulatory sandboxes stemming from the financial, the fintech world are something that we should look at, because they are going very fast, but we are not still yet there. We are not yet there.
Okay, thank you so much. We have 3 minutes left. So I have the last question for Daniel, and then I'll give you both 1 minute to conclude for the closing remarks. Daniel, I was wondering, what is your take from the American perspective? So for example, if there was a similar study run in the US, do you expect the results would be the same, different, completely different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think my instinct is that the results would be similar. I think what we're picking up here is that different stakeholder groups use language in different ways. And whether that's sort of innate or strategic, I'm not sure. This goes to my question about what are the causal stories, or what are the explanations. But my suspicion is that there are inherent differences among stakeholder groups in how they even deploy regulatory language. I think that's a very interesting observation, because it goes, as I said before, to, almost regardless of what language is adopted in regulation, it's going to continue to be contestable in regulatory practice. And that, of course, that's in some sense, we know that language is not self-defining. But I think this really just shows very viscerally that there is a power in the deployment of language in different voices that begins even well before regulation is adopted.
If I can just add one word, do we have 1 minute?
It's like we have 2 minutes left, so it would be as a part of closing remark.
Okay. Since we have in the two different legal system, which are the European one and the US one, we should absolutely take into consideration the role of the case law, which can be definitely factored in to the idea of rule coding. And as far as the EU is concerned, definitely the decisions by the European Court of Justice, especially in interpretative decisions, should be taken into consideration because they clarify the way terms should be interpreted. While in the US, I think that definitely those cases that given the role of the president, of course, all the case law should be relevant differently, no matter what case law, but it should be definitely factored in. And this explains also the relevance of the databases like Westlaw and all the rest, which is less relevant in a European perspective.
Okay, thank you. And Daniel, do you have your final word?
No, again, just thank you to Fabiana for a really interesting paper, and I'm very interested to see the extensions. One suggestion, if it's possible, is whether it's, and this goes to Pierre's question as well about nationality of different stakeholders, whether it's possible to code for nationality and see how that affects the results. I don't know if it's possible or not, but I'd be very interested to see that.
Thank you very much. Our time is up. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for the discussion, and thank you for the questions. And I'm giving the floor back to Thibaut for the next panel.